This podcast is brought to you by ProLongevity, the award-winning 8-week program that can transform the lives of people with prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, and many other lifestyle-related illnesses. Founded by Graham Phillips, the pharmacist who gave up drugs.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the ProLongevity podcast. And I'm absolutely thrilled to have with me my old friend Ivor Cummins, who we go back many years. And I appeared on his podcast a year or so ago, and we had all sorts of interesting and informative chats, and some of which we'll take to a deeper level today. But one thing that we really missed, and I think gets forgotten, is this wonderful book. And as you know, most of the people I've interviewed have had a book out. And the one thing we never really mentioned was Ivor's book. And I have to say, it's still my go-to book. It's the one I recommend to everyone. It's still the one I turn to. How long ago did you write it, Ivor?
Hey, Graham. Thanks for that. It was back in 17. I'm not sure, do we release March 17 or March 18? But it was a lot of work. We spent a long time with editors to structure it as best as possible. So, yeah.
Well, it's still my go-to. So, I mean, I remember when I was first getting into this sort of low-carb, keto, cardiometabolic health, I stumbled across your YouTube channel. And then you were sort of mentioning the book, and I bought the book. And honestly, I think at that stage, certainly in my journey, I learned more from your YouTube channel and more from the book than anyone. So I'm so grateful because of it's allowed me to go forward, but also it's benefited my own personal health. So it's an absolute delight to have you on the programme.
Lovely. Thanks a lot, Graham. And looking forward to the chat and being interviewed for a change too.
Yeah, we turn the tails. I mean, I know it's hunter turned gamekeeper, or however you want to, poacher turned gamekeeper, or however you want to say. So people will inevitably look at your channel, which is fantastic, and you go into some fantastic depth of things. I'm not aiming for that depth today. I'm kind of aiming at a gentle introduction for people who are at the start of the journey. And I think we who've been on this journey, I've been on the journey for 10 years. I think we forget what our starting point was, and I think we forget how far we've come. And I think it's very easy just to start on rung 6, 7, or 8 of the ladder. And people need rungs 1, 2, and 3. So I'm going to kind of start at the kind of bottom of the ladder and work from there. And then people can use that as a springboard to go forward with. So that's the plan for today. And I think pretty much like everyone in this space, as you know, I've had Asim on, I've had Robert Lustig, I've had some of the guys from Public Health Collaboration. We all have our own individual personal journey. And you have yours. So I thought we'd actually start with what your background is and what your journey was and how your road to health was founded on a road, if you like, to ill health.
Yeah, Graham. Well, I'll keep it relatively brief, but I did biochemical engineering originally in 1990. I then spent around 25 years in complex problem solving, mainly going up to a master technologist level and then a people manager over teams of problem solving engineers. And I basically, my whole life, I found my kind of thing in life was complex problem solving, multi-factor, all branches of science. So the funny thing is people say, oh, you're not a virologist or you're not an immunologist, but what they don't understand, I guess, is that if you're a highly, highly technical person who's worked for decades in all branches of physics, chemistry, biochem, and everything, you can relatively easily go in and dig deep and go where you need to go in any particular specialty. So that's what I was doing for 25 years. But then I got poor blood tests, like you say, ill health. They were routine blood tests, so there was nothing special or unusual in there. And the 3 ones which were bad were high cholesterol, our old friend, and high serum ferritin, which is the iron loading in the blood. It can indicate hemochromatosis, a high iron loading disease that destroys your organs and makes you die young. The simple solution, though, is you just give blood, phlebotomy, and it clears the iron. And the third one was high gamma glutamyl transferase, or gamma GT, which is a liver enzyme. And it indicates either excessive alcohol intake, which is the cliched classic,
Yep.
But much more common nowadays, it will indicate insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes type problems, which offend the liver and cause the enzyme to go high. So rough and tough, I went to the doctor who got the tests. I looked and I realized that these were really high. I didn't understand fully the implications of these tests, but I could see the reference range of the population on the laboratory printout. And I quickly scanned that, reading upside down, the doctor showing me.
As you do.
And I could see the ranges and I go, wow, these are really significant, And so I quizzed the doctor, 2 key questions in my whole life, professional life. When I'm brought in to fix a problem and I'm given the experts who are struggling, always ask 2 questions. What are the implications of these readings? And what are the primary root causes that could be tackled to resolve them? Yeah. And the doctor couldn't really answer very well. And I noted this. Long story short, I went to a more senior doctor, a family friend, not much different. And then a teaching professor of medicine, published guy. And it wasn't much different. So they threw out some things, but the hemochromatosis, well, I didn't have that. I got a test. The cholesterol, they said, maybe eat less fatty food and eat more whole grains. That turned out to be the opposite of what I did. And it was just meandering. So I jumped into the research. I did what I do in real life when I'm called in and the team is struggling. I jump in myself. Went through around 3 or 4 intense weeks, went through hundreds of published papers in ResearchGate, PubMed, human trials, mechanistic papers, and I followed those blood markers to find out what would cause them to be bad. And hey presto, I ended up smashing straight into insulin. Insulin resistance, which I'd never heard of. And when I got that, I decoded the ferritin as well. Ferritin is a 4th or 6th marker, it turns out, for insulin resistance. Most doctors never heard of that. And
no, they don't test for it.
Yeah, and I found out all about cholesterol then, and then I went on a huge odyssey into cholesterol metabolism. But that was essentially it. I cut out all the refined foods, the carbohydrates. I ate meat, fish, and eggs and vegetables pretty much. And in 8 weeks, I lost around 15 kilos, around 30 pounds. All my blood markers got perfectly fixed. And I realized I'd stepped on something huge, personally.
And most people at that stage would have just said, okay, well, I'm sorted and carried on. But you didn't do that, did you? So what was the next step?
The next step was, no, you're exactly right. That's just not me. Yeah. I had realized that in the world of medicine, there was an unbelievable, enormous hole that had been going on for 30 or 40 years. They were focused on cholesterol, which was largely nonsense. Not completely. I mean, the ratios of cholesterol had some relevance. Yeah. They were completely missing insulin resistance, and they were completely missing in the world of nutrition that to fix metabolic problems and modern chronic disease, you have to eliminate processed foods and refined carbohydrates. And that ends up meaning you eat more real foods like meat, fish, and eggs, and more natural fats. It's not like you run after and stuff yourself with fats and butter like the crazy guys. You just end up eating more of that because that's the real food. And I realized all the overweight people, all my overweight employees, I was seeing insulin resistance all around me. Like, it was like in the Matrix. I said, half of these guys are essentially type 2 diabetic, undiagnosed. So I said, right, I'm going to tell them. So I put out an advanced technical talk, which I'd given many of, on my corporate technology topics, but I put one out and I didn't tell anyone what it was. I just said, Ivor Cummins, the biggest room in the whole factory of thousands of people that I booked. And I said, the Metabolic Syndrome.
Yeah.
And everyone's going, huh? And I wouldn't tell them what it was. Standing room only, right? On the day. I went an hour and a half, and one of the guys, a great guys there, Trevor Land, he was a kind of a videographer guy, an enthusiast. And he said, I'll record it, Ivor. Sounds great. He recorded it. I put it on YouTube. And then I did one in work for cholesterol. I had to do 2 sessions because the biggest room in the factory couldn't fit everyone. Had to do 2 sessions. Went on YouTube. And that's where people began to flock towards me. Like Mike Eads, MD, was one of the first, and other top people in low carb. They love the cholesterol lecture, etc. But I just realized in short, Graham, I can help an enormous amount of people here, starting with, hundreds of technicians and engineers in my corporate, and then put it on YouTube. And rest history.
And that's kind of quite bold and brave, really. You could have simply done what most people would do, is quietly fix yourself and carried on regardless, and they never mentioned it again. And then, of course, you've had to take on the whole medical establishment, the pharma establishment, and big food, and so it goes on, which is somewhat parallel to my journey, but on a much more modest scale. So, you mentioned metabolic syndrome along the way there. And I kind of want to say a little bit more about that. So I think people have heard of diabetes and they've heard of cancer, they've heard of dementia, but metabolic syndrome still sounds a bit of a mystique about it. So what is metabolic syndrome? How do we recognize it?
Right. Well, a syndrome is not a very specific diagnosis, but there's 5 signs of this syndrome that's associated with heart attacks, cancers, and everything else bad in the world. So it's really important, and it's the biggest disease kind of state in the world. So high triglycerides, low HDL, good cholesterol, high blood glucose, high blood pressure, and LDL, bad cholesterol, is not even in it, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And the other one is, what's the 5th one?
Waist. I think it's a big
waist size. Women, men, it's slightly different. I think it's 33 men or over 35 women, or vice versa. So if you've got 3 of these 5, you're declared to have or probably have the syndrome. But the real name for it is insulin resistance syndrome. They just didn't really understand what it was.
Yeah.
They just gathered together what seemed to be the important measures. But it's actually insulin resistance syndrome. And you're absolutely right. People say type 2 diabetes is terrible, heart attacks and dreadful stuff. But insulin resistance syndrome is in situ type 2 diabetes, which is before it's diagnosed. It is type 2 diabetes. It is hyperinsulinemia. It is da-da-da. Yeah. They're all the same thing, right? So metabolic syndrome, when you hear it, just think type 2 diabetes, whether diagnosed or not. That's simple. If you have metabolic syndrome, consider yourself to be a type 2 diabetic. Now, that'll wake some people up, because people will be there and their doctor will say, your blood glucose is 5.6. It has to be over 6.5 to be a type 2 diabetic. You're not a diabetic. You are. Because if you measure insulin, you're going to be type 2 diabetic. So that's the way to think of it, I think.
And, I've had Asim on the podcast, and he pointed out to me, I think, if you pick those 5 parameters of metabolic syndrome and look at the American population, only 15% of Americans haven't got at least one of the markers. Or to turn that on its head, if we carry on as we are, the entire westernized world is going to have diabetes or some version of it. I mean, it really is. I don't want to get too much into the COVID pandemic, but when you look at the scale of the deaths that are being caused by this combination of diseases, cancer, dementia, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and the millions of people who are dying from it, and we say nothing, we shrug our shoulders, we take a statin, and look how the world has reacted to COVID. Well, if you reacted proportionately, we'd be doing something about it, wouldn't we?
Yeah, I mean, it's tragic. And again, I've been watching this, as you have, for many, many years now, and it never ceases to amaze me. But I guess a lot of nutritional or companies or food companies and pharmaceutical, they're involved a lot in education of nutritionists and doctors. And I think it's not that they created the bad science. The bad science was created by mistake, by Ancel Keys and these guys 50 years ago. But they certainly encouraged the bad science to stay alive because it's profit. So we end up in this absurd situation. But the funny thing, Graham, I interviewed Dr. Ron Rosedale in April 2020. And again, we're not going to get into the C word. But the reality is, you've got this enormous death that could easily be tackled, not being tackled, like you say. There's a relatively much smaller amount of death for much more aged people on average related to the viral problem, COVID. But even that, if you look at someone who has high vitamin D and no insulin resistance, you could have divided that hit from COVID by maybe 10 or 15.
Yeah.
So you could have made that disappear too if you address the real problem, because the immune system is so intimately connected to whether you're insulin resistant or not.
Yeah.
So
definitely I want to come back to that. So please don't let me forget. So all health professionals know that there's a cluster. You see these diseases as a cluster, right? So most of us are aware that diabetes, dementia, cancer, cardiovascular disease appear as a cluster. But the way that we diagnose and treat it is entirely separate. So we wait for the symptoms of one and we try and suppress it with a drug. We wait for the symptoms of another, might be raised blood pressure. We try to suppress it as a drug. We're not taught anything about root cause. And one of the guys that I follow is Chris Kenobi. And he's got this incredible talk, and he describes, I think they have remarkably good health records in Boston. And they've got longitudinal health records of cause of death going back 120 years. And there was basically no recorded deaths from any of those diseases 120 years ago. So it's a new modern, pandemic doesn't really do it justice. None of us as health professionals are ever educated. We know that society is getting fatter and sicker and sicker and fatter. And we're getting undeniably better at diagnosing things earlier. And yes, some of the drugs are better than we used to have. Undoubtedly, we're pretty good at controlling blood pressure, for example. But there is I now understand that there's a root cause, single, if you like, root cause that links all these things together. Maybe you'd explore that a bit for us, because in your many YouTube videos and indeed in the book, you go into some depth to explain that there are some fundamental underlying cellular and subcellular processes in common across all these diseases, linked, through insulin, through sugar, through inflammation, that you it's buy one, get four free, but in a very bad way. But equally, if you can reverse one, to some extent, you've reversed all of them. So perhaps we'd explore that a bit.
Yeah, Graham. And you said a few things there. So if you...
It's the common cause. What links these diseases is what I'm trying to get to.
True. That's the key thing. So it reminds me of a phrase I came across in a published paper many years ago, the common soil hypothesis. And a lot of people think that, these are multi-factor problems, genetics and this and that and the other, and heart disease has 300 causes. It's impossible to say which one it is, and it's too complex. But the common soil hypothesis is largely, like Dr. Kenobi said, we have an explosion of modern chronic disease. And yes, a lot of things have changed in the modern world, and some people go on about pesticides and contaminants and leaded fuel. But the real overriding one is we've utterly changed what we put in our mouths. And if you think about it, pesticides can have an effect, and stress can have an effect, and all these things in modern world have an effect. But the explosion had to be something really central to the organism. And what's most central? Well, it's the fuel and nutrition that comes into your body, to your mouth. That's how the outside world interacts with you and your health overwhelmingly the most, right? Yeah. So what you eat. And in a root cause, in my world, I've always lectured engineers about this in postmortems we do after a major issue that cost a couple of $1 million and took us 10 weeks of experiments and overtime. But when you actually get to the end, nearly always you can summarize the 2 or 3 key interacting factors, and you've got it. And it seems simple. It seems simple after the fact. It's hell for 10 weeks when you're experimenting on 1 million variables, but afterwards. So a true root cause, when you resolve it, what's special about that is it fixes your primary problem, but almost inevitably, a lot of other little problems resolve themselves too, because it was a systemic underlying major issue. and a lot of other stuff you had trouble with goes away, and you go, whoa. So it's like bonus time. That's a true root cause. So the root cause here is primarily, and I'm going to put it as simply as possible for the people, the devil's triad, right? Yeah. Satan's triad. This is what I often say to keep it simple. Sugars, refined carbohydrates, refined wheats, and seed oils, vegetable oils, the heart-healthy oils, which are far from it, right? Those three together are the triad. And what's special about that is, it's like whack-a-mole. You can try and reduce one, the other, the other. The problem is that the UK now, in the British Medical Journal, it's acknowledged that over 50% of UK calories are ultra-processed foods. And in America, it's higher.
Yep.
So over 50% of the most important thing in your health, i.e. what flows into your machine, is now made up almost exclusively of the devil's triad.
Yeah.
Ultra-processed food is by definition, almost exclusively, mostly, sugars, refined grains, and seed oils, because they're cheap as hell, they're addictive, and they have high shelf life, especially vegetable oils gives shelf life because they're toxic and bugs won't eat them. That's what we've done. We've switched to 50% of our diet being the three key worst things to eat on the planet. And we did all that in the last 70, 80 years, increasingly. That's 100%. As simple as I can make it.
And I had Robert Lustig on the podcast. His book, Metabolic, if you want to dig into this in some more detail, absolutely brilliant resource. And he challenged me, but fortunately, I'd seen enough to know the answer, which is this, can this really be defined as food? And I've reflected upon it, and the food that we're designed to eat is very high in nutrition and actually relatively low in calories, because we don't need a lot of calories, particularly in the modern world. And we've got this kind of inverted pyramid. Maybe it would, Boris would call it an inverted pyramid of piffle. I don't know. We've got this inverted pyramid where we're eating lots of calories, but very little actual nutrition. And the conclusion I've reached, I mean, I call it the trifecta of evil, but it's another version of what you're saying. It's basically poison with added calories. And I don't think that's the definition of food. The fact that it's got calories in it, but no nutrition, doesn't make it food. So maybe we'll just explore a bit, because I said there's a common root cause that it might play out in one person as cancer, it might play out in another person as dementia, in another person it might play out as diabetes. So let's just dig into this a little bit. So we've said it's the trifecta of evil: sugar, carbs, and processed food. Let's now look at what they have and how they affect insulin and how they affect the cell and cellular mechanisms. That explains the root cause.
Right, yeah. So the ones with vegetable oils are quite complex, and we must put a link afterwards to Mike Ead's great talk in Denver conference I was at on why the vegetable oils are fattening. And indeed, to Chris Kenobi, fantastic work in vegetable oils. Yeah. But essentially, the problem with vegetable oils, you would say, is they are inflammatory fats by their nature. So they're dominated by omega-6. And omega-6 is a more pro-inflammatory fat. And I remember Professor Jeff Volek said something I thought was really great years ago in San Diego. He said, think of these essential oils, omega-3 fish oil and omega-6, right, which is more from vegetable oils and certain nuts, etc. Think of them not as calories or food or fuel. You do not want to be eating them as fuel. They were traditionally taken less than 1% of your diet for human evolution, and now we're up to 9, 12, 15%.
Yeah.
They are essential, but they were never intended to be taken as calories, as fuel. Yeah. Don't eat them as fuel. Eat them in real food as almost like a supplement. Yeah. So when you eat excessive omega-6, it tends to be pro-inflammatory, right? And the other problem with the vegetable oils is that they are easily oxidizable.
Yeah.
So there's two layers to that problem. One is excessive omega-6 by its nature is putting in a lot of oxidizable, double bond fats that are more prone to oxidation and attack and building more and more of it into your cell membranes. So that's a cellular thing, oxidized fats. That's not good. But the other thing is that the seed oils are extracted with hexane and solvents and high temperatures and pressures, and therefore they will carry within them oxidation even before you eat them, and they're exposed to your body's adverse environment. So that's kind of trying to summarize vegetable oil simply. I always remember, it was quite funny, a guy in Australia put out a lump of butter on a plate on a warm day and a big lump of margarine, and the ants were all over the butter on this one plate, and none of them on the margarine. So it's like these processed foods that go under the car, the chips from McDonald's that go under your car seat. They never really decay. So, and that's because there's senses there. To let people know as well, seed oils, vegetable oils, to bring it home and personal, they, at a step in the process, they have a rancid grey muck that's offensive. I think they wear respirators when they're making vegetable oil. But they then go through a deodorizing step. And it was a Dr. Kate who's spoken at length on, I forget her second name. She has a great book as well, Deep Nutrition, a lot of vegetable oil science in there. But she was saying that nature has warning molecules to animals. In other words, what they're making is rancid and stinking. But human technology allows them to remove all those warning signs and then add color and make it non-disgusting. And then we eat it. So they actually take away nature's warning. So sorry, that's a real brief vegetable oils. And
I agree with all that. I've actually got that image somewhere on. I snapped it from somewhere, and you're quite right. All the ants are clustered around the butter, and none of the ants are clustered around the margarine. And I often tweet it and say the ants know what to eat. It's just the human beings that don't.
That's it. I mean, I think it was Lustig or possibly who said that humans are the only animals smart enough to make their own foods and the only animals stupid enough to eat them.
I think that's right. I guess the other additional point I'd make beyond what you've already said around cell membranes is also that it produces dysfunction at the mitochondrial level. So it literally poisons the mitochondria, which are the energy generating mechanisms of the cell. And I will link to Chris Kenobi's talk on that because he's elucidated the mechanism for that and describes it extremely well. And I think for me personally, Chris Kenobi's educated me more on the evils of seed oils than anyone. I'm not saying he's the only one. There are others, but that talk is just absolutely, I think it was Low Carb Down Under that he spoke. And there's another one, Ancestry. And those two talks are just astonishing. Okay, so we've kind of done the seed oils brief justice and people can go further into it. And the other side of it is the refined carbs and the sugars. So let's now discuss that and their role in insulin and then how that causes damage in all sorts of levels.
Yeah, so the refined carbohydrates, I'm going to focus mainly on one aspect from my genius level good friend Gabor Erdoshi in Hungary, who I've worked with for many, many years. And Gabor is just unbelievable for research. And he's often countered the low carb and keto world and said, well, actually, that's not true, or this is not necessarily true. So he's raised some eyebrows because he is a purist for the science. So I recorded him in Prague, I think, at the Food Loose conference a few years ago, his talk, and it's a brilliant talk, and we should add that link in too. Yeah. But we know that eating excessive sugars raises your blood sugar, promotes the release of excessive insulin, which is released to drive down that blood sugar because high blood sugar is bad. Yeah. And over time, it tends towards more and more insulin release. But more insulin, ironically, has an effect on all the cells that have insulin receptors. They feel more insulin all the time because you're eating too much crap. And they tend to revert or reduce their sensitivity to insulin. It's a self-protective mechanism. And it's appropriate. In a normal ancestral diet, the problem won't occur. Yeah. But as the cells become insulin resistant, Now the body is left with a kind of a connected problem, because now it needs more insulin relatively to manage the sugar in the gob problem. And you can see there a vicious cycle arising. More insulin resistance in response, keep putting in the sugar and grains, more insulin needed, more insulin response. And that's a classic destructive feedback loop in engineering problems. But doctors just don't understand it. So that's the simple view, the simplified view of why sugars and refined grains. But Gabor brought in all the deeper mechanisms. And he brought in GIP, the hormone released in your upper gut. It's glucose insulinotropic polypeptide. There's a mouthful. I'm surprised I remember that from years ago.
I always struggle with that one too, yeah.
Yeah. And GIP is in the upper intestine, is released in response to sugar and sugar mixed with fat, which is a pretty insulin-genic combo.
Yeah.
So it's not when the sugar gets out of your food into your bloodstream that triggers the insulin. That's the least of insulin trigger. The big trigger for insulin is GIP right up here in your upper gut.
Yeah.
And that signals adipose tissue to start getting ready to store fat, right? Because sugar and fat's coming in. Now, this is a bomb. We're going to have to put this crap away somewhere. So it triggers to the adipocytes. It also triggers the beta cells in the pancreas to start gearing up to pump out insulin. So it's triggered from here because the sugars are sensed right up here in the stomach and the upper intestine. And down lower in the intestine, there's GLP-1. And GLP, if GIP is bad to trigger, think of GLP down lower as good to trigger, because that has anti-diabetic properties, appetite suppression properties, and lots of good stuff. Yeah. So the question people got to be asking is, what foods would I eat to minimize GIP, obviously, and to kind of enhance GLP-1? And it's very simple. Yeah. You can eat meat, fish, and eggs by all means. That'll do it. That's fine. But you can also eat carbohydrates. What kind of carbohydrates can you eat? Unprocessed carbohydrates. Because unprocessed carbohydrates are evolutionary foods, or plantains, or whatever the Catavans are eating. They're kind of highish carb, but they don't get heart disease. Those actually don't trigger GIP. They're slowly digested and absorbed, and they actually trigger GLP-1 on the lower end, the good thing. So Gabor's point, and it's crucial and a little controversial in low carb, it's not the carbs per se that are the problem. It's the mechanical processing of them.
Yeah.
And he had studies on apple juice going back 50 years, unbelievable. You eat an original apple, an old-fashioned apple, not a modern sugary apple, right? You eat the apple, GIP not so up, GLP-1 up. It's fine. Yeah. You puree or mash the apple, now it ain't good. And if you turn it into juice, bingo, right? Same with oranges, same with everything. Same with root vegetables.
Yeah. It's interesting you should mention that, because I'm having a Twitter war with Innocent Smoothies at the moment, who are owned by Coke. And I did a little test because I'm wearing my CGM. I did a little test the other day, and I drank some Innocent Smoothie and just said, now I'm non-diabetic. I've got a healthy metabolic profile. CAC score, so there's no calcium in my arteries. Healthy guy. I had about a 250, 300 ml swig of this delightful Innocent Smoothie, and it is absolutely lovely drink. And it took my normal resting background blood glucose, which is around 5.5, up to 12 point something. To put that in context, that's going from a healthy non-diabetic level to way into the diabetic. And nothing elevates my blood glucose like Innocent Smoothies. It's extraordinary. So I always say to people, eat your fruit, don't drink it.
Exactly. Oh, and by the way, disclosure, this podcast was brought to you by Innocent Smoothies.
Not. Well, it's interesting. They tweeted me back and said it's low GI. I said, sorry? So they then purported to send me a scientific paper proving that Innocent Smoothies are low GI. So I'll send that to you for your amusement, and we can talk about it.
I'll take a look. Well, that's another thing just for listeners. And again, staying not too complicated, GI and GL. So GI is the glucose index of foods, as in its tendency to raise, and GL is the glucose kind of load. So if you eat a tiny amount of a chocolate bar, yeah, it's high GI, but the low glucose load for that meal is very little because you multiply it by like 1 gram.
Yeah.
And glucose load then brings into account the GI and also how much of it you ate or what percentage in the food. So glucose load, you could say, is the more important thing. But a smoothie, you're bringing in a fair load, and of course it's high. I mean, macerated food, to Gabor's point, he showed paper after paper with grains, porridges, apples, all done over the last 50 years. It's always the same. Once you mechanically break down the fiber structure, and he makes the point, they're adding in fiber now, powdered fiber into foods to make them high fiber. It's a complete scam. They get the fiber number up, but the reason higher fiber carbohydrate foods are better for you than the refined stuff is because the structure was not smashed in the first place.
Yeah.
So, if you eat steel rolled oats, they have a low glucose response generally because of GIP, GLP-1 and moving through the tract. And if you eat the powdered ready break oats, bingo, you hit the fairground bell on your CGM or your continuous glucose meter. And there's a simplicity to this people should understand. And potatoes, I love this one. If you get potatoes and you eat them raw, well, you don't get much of a glucose hit at all, right? And you probably get sick.
Yeah.
If you boil potatoes, the glucose index goes well up, obviously. And that's why we don't eat too many potatoes, particularly if you're insulin resistant. If you bake them, it's around twice as bad, the glucose insulin response, because of the chemical structure in the baking process. I'm not sure the exact detail, but there's a hack. If you cook the potato, like boiled potatoes, cool it right down, and even you can warm it up again later or have it in a salad, it's turned the glucose into resistant starch, a different chemical chain structure, and it becomes way lower glucose response. So if you really, really like your few potatoes and you're insulin resistant, you can actually cook them, cool them, and just warm them up again. And you're going to get way lower glucose and insulin response because you're making them back more like unprocessed carbohydrate.
Yeah, I do recommend that often to ProLongevity clients, and it works for rice, it works for bread as well, for the same reasons. So let's just come back to this because I kind of diverted us really. So we've talked about the glucose spikes, and we've talked about the fact it's more complicated, and you've done some justice there. And we've talked about the glucose spike raising insulin. What happens next with the insulin resistance? But there's also a direct effect on the lining of the endothelium as well in the cardiovascular system. And you were the one who educated me about the Glycocalyx. And I still don't think many people know about the Glycocalyx. So I think to kind of, before we move on and to do this proper justice, that is another area that we should just cover briefly.
Right, Graham. Well, yeah, your basic effects, insulin, there's papers on this that I discovered in my first few weeks, actually, way back. Insulin tends to promote inflammatory forces in the endothelial layer. So the inner single cell layer that protects the inside of your arteries. Yeah. And it promotes incorporation of lipids into the arterial wall. And there's loads of inflammatory arterial disease driving properties of high insulin, no question. But high glucose also causes a lot of problems. Yeah. So when we look at the endothelium, people think of it as, well, that's the inside, but there's a boundary layer there. And there's this microscopic structure of the Glycocalyx, which is like strands, it's like fields of hairy grass on the inside of the endothelial cells. So think your blood here flowing, and you've got your endothelial cells here in a line, and you've got like grass growing out of them, hairs. And that structure is incredible. It's full of enzymes and all kinds of things to protect the artery. There's mechanosensors in it, so it actually senses the flow of the blood, and it triggers release of nitric oxide depending on the turbulence of the blood flow. I mean, it's that exotic. And they only discovered it 30, 40 years ago, because when you take out an artery, it basically disappears straight away. But there's studies showing that high glucose and glucose spikes seriously damages that glycocalyx. And it is your crucial non-slip active chemical layer that protects your endothelial cells. And we know from Dr. Malcolm Kendrick and from many other sources that endothelial cell insult and damage, right, leads to the intima problems, the layer underneath the endothelial cells, that leads to atherosclerosis, blood clots, plaque, calcium scores. It's all around the endothelial layer. But the endothelial layer is crucially protected by the glycocalyx. And that is massively undermined by blood glucose and blood glucose spikes. I think when they show a diabetic, or in studies introducing high glucose, you can measure the components of glycocalyx, I think it's halion, that suddenly turn up in the blood everywhere when you've damaged it, because it's breaking apart, and you can now measure all its elements showing up in the blood. Destruction.
Yeah. So you can kind of understand the link between diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and the trifecta of evil. I think we've done a reasonable job on all of that. Along the way on Pass On, you mentioned our good friend Ancel Keys. And I think no exploration of this topic would be complete without saying a little bit more about our dear friend Ancel. So perhaps you'd say a little bit about that, and I'll chip in a bit if there's anything that I think I can usefully contribute.
Right. Well, Ancel, yeah. Ancel actually believed his own BS actually at the start. So it's not like he made it up to make future decades pharma and food industry rich. He was a very vain and aggressive man. And he was a fish physiologist back in the 50s. So he wasn't even a doctor or an MD or anything like that. But he got into the heart disease thing. And he basically became a kind of guru that said he knew the cause of heart disease. Yeah. And he was claiming, essentially, this is interesting, it just occurs to me, we're talking about one single broad primary root cause. Well, he actually claimed that phenomenon. I've got the single broad primary cause that most heart disease is caused by. Yeah. But he said it was cholesterol and connected to that fat. Yeah. So he discovered anyway over his journey that when you put in a lot more cholesterol in the human diet, it doesn't really change the blood cholesterol. So he was honest about that, and he backed off from blaming cholesterol in the diet, because he did realize himself it doesn't change. And the reason is your liver makes around 70% of your body's cholesterol. It's the most crucial molecule in the body. And if you eat more cholesterol, your liver backs off and makes less. And if you eat less, your liver makes more. So your body makes loads of cholesterol no matter what you eat. So quickly moving on from that, he then blamed fat, that it was the fat raising the cholesterol, because he did note if you ate more fat, at least in a short time period, you tended to have higher blood cholesterol. And later he got to saturated fat, because there was question marks about whether the fat...
Moving the goalpost, didn't he? As his ideas were undermined by the reality, he moved the goalposts,
And the funny thing was, a real problem solver actually keeps moving and redirecting based on the data to correctly get to the core of the primary root cause. Ancel did the exact opposite, like so many do. He followed his own biases and purposefully, not on purpose, but by following his biases, he actually turned away from cause and went right down the toilet. But the long story short was he was highly political, and he did a 6 countries junk study, which looked at 6 countries across Europe and I think the US. And he looked at the correlation, and he showed that the higher the percentage of fat in the diet, the higher the heart disease. But there were 22 countries at the time where they had full data. And he picked the 6 that sat in a line. And when you looked at all 22, of course, it was a shotgun plot. There was no correlation.
Absolutely.
Very
but no
sneaky.
one knows it. No one knows it.
And he was countered by senior professors at the time, pointed this out. And there's a famous paper, was it Hillebank or, I forget the name. And he basically just turned on the politics and he just screamed at them, and he got his organizations to attack them and call them quacks. And he just said anything to discredit them.
Yeah. What's going on in Ukraine right now is horrendous.
Yeah.
Driven by a psychopath. And it's very hard to imagine that you could have the same thing in the food and science world with similar results. But actually, if you look at Ancel Keys, he was that kind of sociopath. He would brook no alternative. And serially, anyone who tried to disagree with him, and there were plenty at the time, they had their headshots taken off, not physically, but metaphorically. And they were denied funding, they became outcast. And it's hard to imagine in the world of science, which is all supposed to be about a search for the truth and honesty, that you would have a sociopath on a scale of someone like Putin. But actually, I'm sure Ancel Keys, and I'm not justifying Putin, heaven forfend, but I want people to realize how that kind of sociopathy can play out in a completely different environment, and the consequences are equally catastrophic, or maybe even more so. Ancel Keys is threaded through the whole history of this. He's threaded through the history of cholesterol and statins. He's threaded through the history of the American Heart Association, their adaptation of seed oils. And you do cover it in your book. But if people want to really understand that, I think the go-to is probably Nina Teicholz's book, where she interviewed everyone all the way through, looked at all the original papers, and it's such a well-researched book. That's another thing that we're linked to. But I mean, Ancel Keys to this day, continues to poison food research, continues to poison how health professionals are educated, and allows the food industry to take advantage of literally telling you that black is white, and selling you unhealthy food, as you call it, the trifecta of evil. And it's misportrayed deliberately as healthy food. And it's just the same as, it's from the cigarette industry playbook. And it's really hard to get people to really understand, the evil intent that's been, that we've all paid this huge price for. Mm. Okay. So sorry, carry on.
Oh, no, just really quickly there. Well, Ukraine, I mean, it's terrible that kind of conflict. But again, we had Syria, we had the war in Iraq, we had Vietnam way back. Human conflict, it's been going on since World War II. There's been tons of these regional conflicts. Yeah. And I don't follow, I'm a World War II buff, but I don't follow those. But interestingly, people have compared Ancel Keys' misleading of the world and creating true unscientific nonsense, or actually anti-scientific, because it's not just meaningless, it's the opposite of the truth. But they've compared deaths from World War II, comparing it to what Ancel Keys set sail. Never mind a local conflict like Ukraine or Syria or any of these in the past. Yep. It's even much bigger than that. Yep. So it's crazy. But I think the key thing is the food and pharma industry were asked by the nonsense science from Keys et al. And the American Heart Association he became an important member of. He corrupted them. The food industry was asked to make foods without saturated fats, but rather with like seed oils.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the best thing that ever happened to them. They didn't make up this problem, but the problem asked them to make foods with the cheapest, longest shelf life, ultra cheap components. And they said, yeah. And then the pharmaceutical industry ultimately, over time, realized that all of these foods and this ridiculous science was going to lead to a lot of metabolic disease, which they have loads of products for. Yep. So those two industries over 30, 40 years, if people want to understand, it's not a single mistake that just kept going and no one questioned it. Anyone questioned it was attacked. Mary Enig, the famous researcher who questioned vegetable oils, she was a specialist in fats and fat metabolism, lost her job at the university around 30 years ago. She was thrown out because industry picked up the phone and said, she's questioning our heart healthy oils.
Yeah.
There's millions of those, many cases of that. So the industry didn't create the madness.
Yeah.
They simply profit off the madness, and they've so much influence. Nutritional and food industry now and pharma together have so much influence. They own the FDA practically. They own the nutrition professionals organizations. They fund them.
Yeah.
So they own it. That's why the insanity keeps going.
Yeah. Which is why I call myself the pharmacist that gave up drugs. So we've kind of talked about the macros so far. And I think we somewhat over-obsessed the proteins, fats and carbs, because actually true nutrition is about micronutrients and gets ignored. And of course, there are vitamins and proteins that are essential to our diet, and they're broadly speaking completely absent or very marginal in these ultra-processed foods, unless you supplement them with something. And the body also has its own set of nutrient sensors. So your body will always try to satisfy itself. And I kind of broadly explain it. It's a slightly naive explanation, but it's not unreasonable, which is if the food you've eaten has twice the calories and half the micronutrients, your nutrient sensors will make you carry on eating well beyond the point of what would normally be satiety in a forlorn attempt to get the nutrition that it needs. And that partly explains why these ultra-processed foods are at this kind of bliss point of a perfect combination of sugar, salt, and fat, which will spike your dopamine and therefore be addictive, but bypasses all the satiety mechanisms. And yet, if you look at what we as a species are designed to eat, ancestrally appropriate foods, everything just works, doesn't it? Because your nutrient sensors tell you when to stop eating. Everything's you're satiated, and you get all the micronutrients that you need. And it kind of always ends up back at red meat and liver, doesn't it? Somehow, if you look at the most nutritionally complete, the very things that have been vilified, and of course eggs, are the things that have got the right balance of the macros, but also are not particularly high in calories, but are really high in nutrition. So everything we've been taught is literally upside down. We live in a world turned upside down.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that is it. It's astonishing. And again, back in 2012, I was making this point. So I went through leptin, ghrelin, insulin, and glucagon. And I still love those slides. I haven't really looked at them in 8 years. And I went through all the control loops for appetite and how this self-reinforcing catastrophic control loop is driven by the 4 primary hormones. And of course, high triglycerides block the appetite suppression signal to the brain. Lustig talked about that. There's papers on it. And I explained it, and the engineers got it because it was explained as loops of control. It's all loops of control. But you're right. I just mentioned Dr. Ted Naiman, good buddy of mine, who did the PE diet. It's protein energy. And it's exactly what you said there. Yeah. It's nutrient density. And he shows different types of meals. And you've got meals that are high calories with low protein and low nutrients. And they're going to make you fat. And then what's the diet that bodybuilders use to get really ripped with ease, along with exercise? And of course, it's a high protein diet. Protein reduces appetite. An example, I've discovered that the other day, I eat 1 meal a day. Now, the reason I'm still chunky is because I also enjoy my wine and all the other stuff. And during lockdown the last couple of years, I let things go a little. And that's okay. But I'm stripping back the weight in the last few weeks, particularly. Yeah. But the other day with my 1 meal, usually I have a very substantial meal with meat, fish, eggs, and vegetables and all that stuff. Maybe even a bit of potato on the side. We're Irish. But the other night, I had a tray of chicken wings. Yeah. Which that's what was in the fridge. My daughter was there. She took 4. I took 6 or 7. Now that's really very little for the day. And after 6 or 7 chicken wings with some chili, Frank's kind of hot sauce, got jalapenos, green, new one out. Oh, after 6 or 7, my appetite just fell off, a cliff. And I didn't eat any more in the next few hours. And I found that if you eat a juicy steak, or particularly chicken wings, including crunching the ends of the bones and all, you're getting those extra collagen-y type things,
Yeah.
your appetite collapses.
Yeah.
And everyone's going to see this. That's why carnivores, when people can't manage a mixed diet and they always end up cheating, some people just go carnivore because it's simple and they know it'll work.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But you're right. The vilification is specifically, it's almost like there was an evil genius up there who not only was profiteering from all the disease which sells pharma and all the addictive foods which sell processed food. It's almost like there's a joined up thinking of evil where these foods that cause health, like meat, fish, and eggs, we have to actually attack those and vilify those because we want the maximum disease in the population for the maximum profit. That's almost like what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a grand conspiracy theory.
No, I'm having fun.
Yeah. I mean, as you say, it's bad science that's been heavily manipulated for profit of the food industry, and then the pharma industry makes you 10% better. And I don't think
on a good day.
On a good day,
10%.
Well, cut me some slack. I am a pharmacist at the end of the day. It's in my blood. So I don't think they set out to do this. I think it's bad science, anti-science that's been hijacked. But now it's so profitable. I mean, the statin industry on its own is $100 trillion industry. They're not going to recant from it. And because the food industry makes most of their profit from the processed food, not the real food, they're never going to recant from that. And as you said, you eat one meal a day, and many days that's what I do. Well, the food industry is never going to convince you that the right thing to do is to eat less food, is it? Not going to happen.
No way.
And I always say to clients, look, I see food as an investment in your health. Fuel your body, with appropriate food. And so you will be spending more on your meals, but you will also be eating a lot less. So you can invest the saving in the 3 or 4 meals a day you used to eat plus snacks, and then reinvest the money in 1 or 2 meals a day that are healthy. Net additional cost, well, it probably will save you money, but it certainly doesn't cost any more to eat in a healthier way once you understand the overall way it works out. Okay.
Absolutely. And just a quick one. I know I'm talking too much, but I'm just really feeling fresh today. Sorry, Graham, but
delighted.
Exactly that. When you think about it, the ultimate diet, eggs are massive nutrition and very good calories per euro or per pound sterling. Yeah, they are actually surprisingly cheap. Liver and organ meats, the ultra nutrient dense super bomb foods, you can buy for next to nothing.
Yeah, because
there's an ethical supplier, fine. Yep. There you go. Even like in Ireland, grass-fed, fatty ground beef or mince, as we call it, is around €4 for a kilogram, 4 or 5 euro or 4 sterling for a kilogram. Now, the lean stuff where they take out the fat that you don't need to be eating at all, that's absolutely €10. But if you only ate meat, fish, and eggs, now fish is expensive, I'll acknowledge that, but tinned fish that's quite high quality can be relatively low cost per nutrient, per calorie too. And 1 meal a day and not eating the fattening stuff that makes you eat more, absolutely, you could eat on a very low budget.
Yeah. So we've kind of given a broad overview of what makes people fat, sick, and healthy, and how what the root causes are and how it plays out at the metabolic level. Very much sort of top line view. But we've mentioned a number of other places people can go to get the detail. So it's very much intended. I'd like to kind of move on to solutions now. And we have touched on it. So, broadly speaking, exercise won't help you lose weight, but will make you healthy. Particularly a combination of high intensity exercise and anything that builds muscle, strength training. I think sleep gets completely ignored. I give this talk, and I say, so you go to your GP, they do some bloods, blood pressure's a bit high, start on this antihypertensive medication, come back and see me in a month. Go back in a month. It's better, but it's still a bit high. We'll add a second antihypertensive, do some more bloods. You go back in a month and they say, yeah, blood pressure's quite good now, but your cholesterol's a bit high, so we'll start you on a statin. Right? And as you walk out the door, you say to the doctor, I'm not sleeping very well. And they just shrug. And
or they give you an antidepressant. Yeah. That's happening lately.
Or they might give you an antidepressant. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting, actually. I've been watching all this stuff recently about saunas. And apparently sauna is one of the best antidepressants that there are, much more effective than SSRIs.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, even I have UV lamps, reptile lamps, and also a UV kind of tanning panel. And I use it during the winter, and it's unbelievable for sleep quality, for vitamin D, obviously, but also for a whole range of hormone releases. It's incredible how well you feel after it. Like when you get a sunny day in UK or Ireland and you get out and you get a little pink and you get the sun, do you ever notice how great you feel that evening? The feeling of well-being, and you sleep. Yeah.
So I think, again, health professionals are generally not educated in sleep or sleep architecture. And I always reflect on Margaret Thatcher, who famously only ever slept for 3 hours, and her best political mate, Ronald Reagan, who was similarly very bravado about sleep. And of course, they both ended up dying of dementia. And if you want to end up with dementia, combination of the trifecta of evil and no sleep and no exercise. Yeah.
Absolutely. And, I actually have to run into town and collect my son shortly, but I just remembered our diagram, or myself and Dr. Gerber in the book, though the diagram we did as we were beginning to publish the book never got in the end. I think there was a big triangle, and it showed type 2 diabetic, kind of one extreme, insulin resistant, and then it showed low insulin, non-diabetic, minimal disease, best life, productivity, mental health, mental acuity, everything. And we just had the top 10 kind of thing. And basically there was the trifecta at the top. You get rid of that. That's the big end of the wedge. Yeah. But then you eat a healthy, nutrient-dense, low-carb, plenty of protein type diet, even after you eliminate the crap. And then we had resistance type training, and we had fasting. So those two things we saw is really important. Like, go to 2 meals a day, maybe 1 meal a day, doesn't suit everyone, but get this fasting keto type behavior and get the insulin resistance, resistance training in for the health. And then we had the 4 S's. We fitted it into the wedge: sun, sleep, stress, and supplements. And detail each one. And I forget what was on the very left-hand corner, the final thing, but there was something. But that's it. If you do all of these, the synergy is going to blow your life away. Yeah. If you went from a Western diet and pretty much followed all of them largely for a few weeks, everyone in work and your relations are going to be looking at you and saying, what's happening? The skin, the jowls will suck up into your face. The stomach will shrink before your overall body weight falls. The one you want to shrink. Yeah. You're going to sleep better. You're going to feel better. You're going to start performing better at work because you're going to feel good, much better. It's not hard. It's not hard,
but somehow it's been made hard. And I'm not making a rude gesture, Ivor. It's an aura ring.
I got a Whoop device.
Yeah,
similar.
And it's really interesting because this is such an effective sleep tracker.
Yeah.
And it gives you incredible data, and you can get the correlation coefficient between any 2 variables if you're into that kind of stuff, which I guess I know you are. I can clearly see on the days when I go to the gym and then I do the sauna, how it has a radical how much better my sleep is.
Yeah.
And how the next 24 hours it benefits me. I can see it not just subjectively because you feel so much better, but objectively you can now use tech to measure the improvements. And I think, I mean, they're a nightmare company to deal with, but the actual device is fantastic. It's one of my favorite devices, and I recommend it to, and I don't get anything out of it, so I'm not sort of on 10% here or anything, but it is a wonderful device if you want to track your sleep.
And Dr. Nadir Ali, he's a good friend of mine in Texas, Eat Mostly Fat Ali, I think, on Twitter, brilliant cardiologist, set up the Low Carb Houston conference and ran it a few years in a row. He's got heavy into cholesterol, LDL, deep science, amazing guy. And he's got deep into sleep in the last couple of years. And he said to me, the Whoop and the Oura Ring are the top of the pack. Yeah. He personally goes for the Whoop. But I can see if I don't go overboard in a few wines in the evening, if I've done exercise or work that day around like maintaining the house and stuff, and I have a high count of exercise, a few of those things together, you get an amazing sleep. Yeah. And the next day you get this big green recovery. You're fit for strain. And the days when you are out with the boys or the guys and you go a bit mad and blah, 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 you sleep badly then, of course. Yep. And the next day you get a big red warning. It's never wrong. And when it's yellow in the middle and you actually feel okay in the morning and you think I'm fine for the day, but you see that it's yellow and not ideal. Yeah. What happens is in the afternoon, you flag on those days. Yeah. You feel fine in the morning, but in the afternoon you fade.
So,
okay.
We're probably coming towards the end. Is there anything that we haven't covered that we should before we kind of conclude?
Oh, I think, no, I think we've covered plenty. It was a great conversation. I can't think of any omissions, and there's plenty there for people to be thinking of. And of course, we can circle back, Graham, which we will do in a while, and maybe have another conversation briefly running through this, but also adding in anything we think we missed. But with the links we're going to include below, you know, and maybe more we think of, this is going to be a huge resource for, as you say, people who are not, you know, or are more new to it rather than the hardcore kind of carnivore guys or whatever.
Yeah. No, what I'd like to do, we've mentioned between us, I think, some really good links. And what we'll also do in the show notes is we'll pick out some of your because your oeuvre is fantastic on YouTube, and we'll pick out a number of them that are relevant to each bit. So you've done the vitamin D debacle, I think it was an hour and a half on vitamin D, and I've watched that several times. And so you've done really deep dives into all of this that people can use as a springboard. So we'll add those in together with, you know, Nina Teichart's book and various others. So finally, what's the best way for people to get hold of you and to follow you? Because I know you've got a new channel out and you're doing some new stuff. So just tell us about that.
Right. Well, so I think my YouTube, Google YouTube Ivor Cummins, you'll get it. That's going to be, there's been a bit of a gap. I was covering quite a lot of the viral challenge stuff and got my hand smacked occasionally for that, by YouTube, because things have gotten very difficult. But anyway, had a bit of a gap, but now I'm going back with all back to metabolic health, heart disease prevention, all that stuff. So the YouTube's going to be great. And Twitter as well. I comment a lot on my Twitter, Fat Emperor, @FatEmperor, and thefatemperor.com. You can sign up to the mailing list there. I'm going to start focusing more on that mailing list. And I put blog posts there and YouTube videos. And I think they're the main things. And right now, as you know, thanks again, Graham, you contributed to our WeLoveOurHeart.com conference. WeLoveOurHeart.com, I'm going to be more and more engaging with Mark and the team there on this whole prevention of chronic disease, not just heart disease, but generally everything we've talked about.
So really, it remains me to thank you very much, Ivor, for being the guy that you are, being prepared to take the world on, and allowing people like me to join you on a journey. And again, your work is fantastic. And let's not forget the book. Again, highly recommended because it's full of science, full of citation, written at a level that people can really understand. And the diagrams in there, as you know, I often tweet the diagrams from your book because when I'm trying to make a point on Twitter, it's my go-to because it's a very clear explanation, referenced and very hard to argue with. So lovely to see you. I'm sure we'll be in touch again, and thanks for your time.
Thanks so much, Graham, and we absolutely will circle back. And no, great stuff. We'll do it again. Bye now.
Bye.
If you enjoyed the podcast and want to find out more, join our Wellness and Pro-Longevity Facebook group. Don't forget to subscribe and follow so you never miss an episode, and maybe share to friends and family who might benefit. Finally, if you think you might need help with diabetes, heart disease, or any of the other diseases we discuss, then book a free consultation with Graham. There's absolutely no charge for this, and we would never put you under any pressure. What do you have to lose? Bye for now, and see you for the next episode.